The following video is on a subject I'm not an expert in, but I have experience in, but I didn't think it would come in handy. Weak Signal Propagation Reporter data, WSPR data. It's a database at WSPRnet. Records deviations, anomalies, signal-to-noise ratio, and connections and interference. Now, what is this about? Ham radio operators need to be able to make contacts between each other and need to figure out if the conditions are at least usable for doing so. Ham radio operators, in many cases, deliberately operate at low wattage. That's something to recognize. Next, in order to get signals over very long distances, you have to use signals that are low enough frequency that they'll bounce off of the ionosphere and the Earth several times. The ionosphere does not have a stable altitude. Sometimes you want it to be a high altitude or a low altitude. Using this database, you can figure out times of year or whatever, using the archival data, to figure out what time of year you will have a low or high ionosphere at a particular time of day or night, depending. It's very oogie boogie kind of guesswork kind of stuff sometimes. And it will show deviations in your transmitter's ability to send a signal and or the receiver's ability to detect deviations in transmitter frequency. Now, this can record information that seems fairly fine-grained, but it shows a lot of rough granularity to it. A deviation, however, of 10 cycles per second out of 10 million cycles per second is detectable and could be used, if you wanted to detect a shift in position caused by some sort of interference source. But you'd have to ignore or be able to cancel out fluctuations of your 10 million cycle per second carrier signal. Skywave refracted propagation, or hops or skip, reflected off the Earth's surface and the variable altitude ionosphere from a 1 watt transmitter. Okay, let's do the scenario that's being brought up literally and directly. Sent from Switzerland, received at Australia, because they're checking high frequency radio propagation conditions. Not very high frequency, just high frequency. In this incident, as recorded, we show a negative 110 decibel meter direct radio wave signal that's excruciatingly weak. Still detectable, but it's within a large amount of noise, or not. We have detected what we're going to assume is interference from something blocking the signal and distorting its wave shape around itself at negative 210 decibel meter out of that negative 110. That's like detecting a whisper during a jet aircraft being launched. Okay. We assume it's forward scattered interference, not any other source causing it. Now that results from like 80 decibels of difference. But it's negative 80 decibels, so it's a very tiny difference. And now our signal-to-noise ratio measurement is negative 81 dB. That means it's more noise than signal, not the other way around. Signal-to-noise ratio, as it implies, if it's a positive number, is you have a loud signal and a noise floor down here. We call it grass. And our signal should be up here. In this case, we're talking about noise being up here and our signal being down here. Now that can still work, and some software can work with that. WSPR logging software and the WSPR network can tolerate negative 30 decibel signal-to-noise ratio. More than that, 81 negative, isn't going to be reliable and should be kind of rejected, shouldn't it? Below 50 megahertz, depending on what you're aiming a signal at or bouncing it off of, a signal will pass through any object, a human being, a tree, a body of water, fog, and be distorted in angle but not in frequency or intensity. Or it might bounce off of something, but more of it goes through than goes ahead and bounces off, especially aircraft below 50 megahertz. And again, we're talking about 10 megahertz range signals here, not going higher, not the ones that we're talking about here. Again, long range requires you not hit the skip frequency limit at 50 megahertz. Comparing that to a signal that would not bounce off the ionosphere and would not give you a long range test isn't fair and is, I don't want to say deceitful. A 1,000 watt plus signal bounced off something to reflect back rather than going through or around, combined with going through and around, 1,000 watts, so you get the noise ratio way low. Or just, force the noise down. Using for aircraft detection does work. But you can't travel more than a third of way around the globe to do it for long range, because at that point you're dealing with a signal going the opposite direction from your transmitter coming around. These are ham operators that are not necessarily aiming a signal from Switzerland to Australia. Look at that on a globe, get a round globe, and look at it. So presuming that the signal that could have taken dozens of paths over the surface of the Earth to get from A to B had to be blocked on a specific pathway does not make sense. Even at 1/3 of the way around the Earth doesn't really work very well, but at least that's kind of useful if you can corroborate it easily from multiple transmitter receiver sources. Doing this with 1 watt transmitter from Switzerland at 10 megahertz instead of something else, having it bounce off of an altitude-changing ionosphere with the Earth, and assuming the last absorption or reflection wasn't the ionosphere, it had to be a plane. Only one of these whisper pathways involved in what this video is about was a short path that could be said to be an incidental interruption by something. That's the other thing, is that not just airplanes cause this interference or disruption. Now, bringing up also that someone decided, besides the blocking and the intensity level, that they should also pay attention to frequency deviations as essentially a Doppler effect when it's 1 in 1 million deviation, which is what you would expect, but at such an extremely low SWR, signal to noise ratio, as an N, and at an extremely low initial intensity level. That's not useful. The other thing is that the transceivers can have deviations easily. 10 cycles per second out of 10 million is damn good and probably would never be compensated for. It might be detectable if you have a really good receiver, and that's actually much easier to do than to make it a perfect signal for transmit. But that doesn't indicate that it has to be an aircraft. Also, this is like screaming over a surface of calm water with a fog bank in the distance and a cloud bank above you. Sounds like a fuzzy, not too precise thing, yes. And then measuring the echo while it's going into a fog bank. Please look up why we have foghorns. All of the assumptions and information above, we will now assume that we are getting blocked and distorted by specific aircraft for a signal propagation to us. And we are presuming that the ionosphere is stable and that thousands of miles of ocean are stable and can be related to a specific aircraft. Next, the main source of the claim later had one time claimed there was a 22-minute holding pattern and then claimed it didn't happen. Was this based on contacts, and should the person totally revise everything? What is the reason for the deletion? Next, the main paper incorrectly stated flat ice or calm ocean provide the best surfaces for WSPRnet signal reflection when it's actually the opposite. paper also mixed together the idea of high-frequency ionosphere reflection to Earth with UHF and VHF aircraft reflections, which are totally different things. And that doesn't mean the individual was ignorant of this. It just means that the statements may have been misstated, but that requires at bare minimum that the original work by the individual I'm going to talk about should be completely redone. Also, the claim that you would have a 300 kilometer across or 300 square kilometer area, it doesn't matter which one, somewhere in the southern Indian Ocean, makes this essentially not really all that useful, but does narrow it down. The ionosphere can be as low as 50 kilometers or 30 miles, but it can be as high as 600 kilometers. And at any one point along the pathway could be different heights. And unless you record that exactly, there's no way to determine whether or not you're dealing with a deviation of 300 kilometers on each square or 300 kilometers total surface area being shifted by it. Also, your supposed return could be just one of those spots at the end of the travel. Instead of it could have been bouncing off the ocean and you're detecting the sky. The creator of the WSPR database thing said, "I don't believe that historical data from this network can provide any information useful for tracking of an aircraft." So the individual who made the claim, or what we're going to be calling it, Richard Godfrey, claimed he called this a global detection and tracking of any aircraft anywhere software. That's what he named his software, or his process. Shows that MH370 crashed between 22 minutes and 27 minutes UTC after specific timing. And that positioning is down to a position of 30 by 98.7 versus 30.57 by 98.75. That's in a 20-minute period of time. An airplane flying for 20 minutes can go over a huge area. And he backtracked a bunch of statements that would be considered key to finding it, like the holding pattern and circling, and the idea that ice or calm ocean would work a certain way when it's the exact opposite. So, now the first thing someone might say is, why are you only going for the negative critiques? Because this individual has made a positive statement with a fairly dense work filled with all sorts of information that's been found to have basic errors and basic assumptions that shouldn't be there, and mixing of data up, and only giving us, I hate saying this, only giving us a 300 kilometer reduction. It's a fairly small area. Should this area be searched? Obviously. It doesn't matter if you throw a dart at a dartboard. At that point, it would be better than not looking. The next thing is that all of this is based on presuming a bunch of things that can't happen in reality, and no ham operators ever really experience more than 2 or 3 minutes apart, with stability in the atmosphere, ionosphere, and ocean that would cause you to be able to do this at all. Next, all this person has to do, Richard Godfrey, is simply track one plane after another going over the same area and get exactly the results they're looking for using the database from WSPR and prove that it works at all, and then retroactively apply it. That hasn't been done enough. It hasn't. Thanks for watching. Have a good day. Good luck with that. It's too low power and too iffy to give us any precision, and it does look like cherry picking on his part. Bye.